Hello everyone, welcome to a little tutorial video that I promised I would make in DAT 101, showing you a little bit more about the Photoshop selection tools and going through what I am going to be asking you to do for the self-portrait assignment. As I mentioned in class, the assignment does not have to be completed with your self-portrait. You can do that if you wish. I am using animals as a stand-in for myself in this tutorial, and you're welcome to use the ones that I gathered together and posted for you in the support materials section of our website, or of Blackboard. And if you would like to find your own, you can use the resources that I listed in the copyright lecture. Pexels.com, P-E-X-E-L-S, one where you can find royalty-free images to use. Pixabay is another one that we also looked at, and Unsplash is another one, and those are all three listed in that lecture that I posted in the support materials section of the Blackboard class as well. So let's get started looking at some of the selection tools. I'll go over the selection tools quickly, and then we will move into actually completing what I would like you to do for this project. Hi, so here we are in Photoshop, and we have the same image open that we used in class, the background image. And I just want to do a brief recap of the selection tools that we covered in class, because we did cover a lot. All of those selection tools are found in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, here at the top of the tool palette. The first one being the rectangular selection tool that allows you to make rectilinear selections. I'm going to click and just drag with that tool to make a square, and you can see that if I click in another location, it automatically creates a new square and gets rid of the old selection. If I want to select multiple areas, I can hold down the Shift key. The Shift key will allow you to add to a selection, so I can continue to make more rectangular selections and select multiple areas at the same time. To deselect, you can click outside those selections or choose Select, Deselect from the menu at the top of the screen, the Select menu, and you can see that Control D is the keyboard shortcut for deselecting. If I drag out a selection and have that area selected, I can also select the opposite of that area by going to the Select menu and choosing Select Inverse, right? And that will select everything outside of the selection that I originally made. You can see the marching ants. The selection marquee changes to update that selection. The keyboard shortcut for inverting the selection is Control-Shift-I, and now you can see the marching ants go away from the outside of this document and are now back in this central section. If I want to save that selection, I can go to Select, Save Selection from the Select menu, and it will create in my Channels palette, hopefully if this updates, sorry, my modal box is off screen, I will just name this Square, click OK, and you can see that it's saved that selection here in my Channels palette, which is next to your Layers palette. And that selection is saved as a white square on a black background, indicating that the white area here is fully selected and the background is fully deselected. If I were to invert that, Control-Shift-I from the keyboard, and then save that selection, you will now see in my Channels palette that I have the opposite. The outside is completely white and the inside is completely black. So the outer section here is selected and the inner section is deselected. I'm going to deselect that with Control D and look underneath the rectangular marquee tool to the elliptical marquee tool, The elliptical marquee allows us to select areas that are circular or elliptical in nature. If I click and drag with that, you can see that I have the option as I'm holding the mouse key down to make all different kinds of elliptical selections. That would be very useful here if I could make a perfect circular selection, and to do that I want to hold down the Shift key when I'm making that selection. That will allow me to make a perfect circular selection. But it's a little difficult to get that selection just in the right spot for the perfect circle because the elliptical marquee tool generally tends to make the selection from the upper left-hand corner. So if you want to make that selection from the center outward, you want to hold down the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on the Mac when you start dragging your circle out. That will start it from the center, and then after you start dragging the circle out, keep holding down Option or Alt and add the Shift key, and that will constrain your selection to a perfect circle. And there we have pretty good selection of just that circle. Now if I want to add another circular selection to that, we hold down the Shift key as we begin and the Alt key, and you can see that my cursor turns into a plus sign there, and I can add that to the other selection. Okay, so we have now 2 of these circles selected. Just deselect that, select and deselect. And let's try some of the other tools here. We have 3 other tools grouped together: the lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool, and the magnetic lasso tool. The lasso tool is designed to allow you to make freehand selections. You would be drawing your selections out with the mouse, which is never an easy thing to do. So some of these other selection tools are a little more precise. The polygonal lasso tool allows you to make line segments. If you have something that you need to select that is hard-edged, but is an irregular shape, that can be a very useful tool. And beneath that we have the magnetic lasso tool, which generally tends to work pretty well when you have a very well-defined edge. So if you have a contrasting edge, you can just click and begin to follow that edge around the object, and you can see here as I stopped and let go of the mouse, the tool just sort of keeps going. If you get into that situation, just hit the delete key and it will begin to delete all those extra dots. And I can move my cursor back to the point where I wanted to stop and just double click, and that will turn that into a selection. All right, so I'll just go over that one more time. Command D or Control D on the Windows machine to deselect. Click and just sort of follow with your cursor the outline of the thing that you want to select. And when you get to the end, hover over the first point that you started with and double click, and it should create a pretty good selection around that circle. If I hold down the Shift key, I can do that with multiple circles and pretty quickly, whoops, that always happens with this tool. You want to just hit the delete key again and go back to the point where you started, and you can keep adding circles to the selection by holding the Shift key down. There we go. So now we have 3 circles selected using the magnetic lasso tool, and that works pretty quickly. It's a fairly intuitive tool. All right, so we've gone over the simple selection tools and the lasso tools, which are a little more complex. Just Control D, Command D on the Mac to delete those selections. And we also looked at some of these more complex tools: the object selection tool, the quick selection tool, and the magic wand tool. I'm going to start with the magic wand tool, and we note that If we look up here into the options palette, the magic wand tool is controlled by the sample size, which is part of the eyedropper tool. The sample size will determine the area that's being selected when you click on a particular color or tonal value in your image. In our case, I like to turn that up to 11 by 11. The default is point sample. When you choose 11 by 11 and click inside the image, it's going to be looking at a grid of 11 by 11 pixels rather than a single point in your image, a single pixel. So it's going to be, in general, a little more accurate selection if you increase the size of that sample a little bit. You don't want to increase it too much because you want to make sure that you are selecting a very specific area. I can change the tolerance in terms of brightness values above or below my selected point that I'm clicking on, and that will allow me to make selections based on a particular color. So for instance here, this orangish circle that I have in my background image, if I click on that, it does a really good job of selecting up to the edges of that orange shape because I have set the tolerance at 37. If I turn that tolerance down quite a bit, turn it down to 12, and we click back in that image, you can see that it doesn't select quite as much because it's selecting a smaller range of brightness values. If I turn that up to something like 69 and deselect and click again, you'll find that it selects a bit too much outside of the image there, where the values are starting to become that blue color. So I think we started at something around 37, and that seemed to be a pretty good place to start for this image. And indeed, that does an excellent job of selecting just that circle. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and add to that selection. And this works really well in this particular case to select these circles. I'm just holding down the Shift key and I'm making my selections based on the color that I'm clicking on, and it is doing a pretty good job of selecting most of the circles that I'm clicking on. In this case, it didn't quite select everything, so I'm going to just click again and add some of those values into my selection. Here, we'll try that one more time there. And you can see that going around, and there it has messed up a little bit. So these values are a little too similar to be able to add just that circle to the selection. So what I want to do in this case is I want to subtract part of that selection. And I can do that by holding down the Alt key on the Windows machine or the Option key on the Mac. And you can see that my magic wand cursor has a little minus sign there beside it, meaning that if I click now, it will subtract that selection from the selection that I'm building here with the Shift key. So using plus and minus, Shift and Alt, or Shift and Option, or the Mac, will allow you to add or subtract to selections. Again, now that I've made the selection, I'm going to save it. So I'm going to go to Select, Save Selection, and we'll call this one Circles. And you can see now that it has appeared here in my Channels palette. Just deselect that. But since we saved the selection, that selection is something that we can return to, and we can reselect that particular channel by either control clicking or command clicking on it if you're on the Mac, control clicking on the Windows machine, and or we can drag that layer, or sorry, that channel down to the Load Channel as Selection icon, which is this little circle of dots here at the bottom of the Channels palette. So in all of those ways, you can save selections, and if they're complicated selections, you can bring them back and use them again, either as a layer mask or as a selection. All right, so I'm going to deselect that. and go back to my RGB image, turn off my channel mask there, and we'll go back to the Layers palette. And that is a quick overview of the major selection tools that we used in class.